The prize sat low in the water, heavy with trade goods she had been hauling since leaving a Caribbean port 3 weeks earlier. Her crew sat on the main deck under armed guard, not quite believing what had just happened to their morning. The cargo below was worth real money. Textiles, sugar, tools, maybe coin. But the man walking her decks that afternoon wasn't looking at the cargo. He was looking at the ship. Her lines, her draft, the way she moved, even at anchor in the slight current. He was running through a set of practical questions that had nothing to do with what she was carrying, and everything to do with what she could become before the week was out. This scene played out across the Caribbean, the Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean for decades, during what historians call the Golden Age of piracy, roughly from the 1680s through the 1730s. If you look at the pirate fleets that actually terrorized those trade routes, you notice one thing almost immediately. Pirates almost never built their own ships. They seized them, and then they went to work on them in ways most people have never really thought through. The popular image of a pirate ship is something like a massive warship with black sails and rows of cannon ports running the full length of her hull. You've seen it 100 times. That image isn't completely wrong, but it's misleading in ways that actually matter if you want to understand how piracy worked as an economy and a survival strategy. Most successful pirate captains weren't commanding floating fortresses. They were commanding fast, light, maneuverable vessels that could run down a target before anyone had time to react, close the distance, and deliver a decisive threat, and then get clear before a naval patrol could respond. The reason pirates had those vessels wasn't because someone designed a special pirate ship. It was because pirates had a practical eye for identifying the right hull inside someone else's fleet and converting it. The myth goes something like this. Pirates were bold sea rovers who took a rich prize and sailed away in their grand flagship, loaded with gold and rum, waving their flag at the whole world. The ship in that story is always impressive, always powerful, clearly theirs by right of conquest and nerve. The reality is considerably more fragile. A pirate crew operating in the Caribbean or along the Atlantic trade routes in the early 1700s didn't have a shipyard or a navy contract or government supply accounts. What they had was their last captured prize, a set of tools, some men who knew carpentry and rigging, and a short window of time before the next patrol came within range. The ship that came out of that process wasn't a symbol, it was a solution to a very practical problem. And here is the problem sitting at the heart of this whole topic. A ship built for trade is not built for speed and attack. A merchant vessel is built around cargo capacity. Her hold is designed to carry as much as possible. Her rigging is conservative, built to be managed by a small crew across long ocean crossings without constant adjustment. Her guns, if she carries any, are light defensive pieces meant to discourage small threats, not fight serious engagements. Everything about a merchant ship reflects the goal of moving goods from one port to another at the lowest possible cost and risk. That is almost exactly the opposite of what a pirate crew needed. A pirate crew needed speed above all else. Speed to catch a target before it could run or signal for help. Speed to close the distance fast enough that the target surrendered without a prolonged fight, because prolonged fights meant casualties, and casualties meant a weakened crew. They needed shallow draft, the ability to sail into coves and coastal shallows where naval frigates couldn't follow. They needed enough firepower to convince any merchant captain that resistance was a bad idea, without so much gun weight that it dragged down their speed. And they needed all of this without a legitimate resupply chain, without a home port where damaged hulls could be properly fixed, and with a crew that could vote a captain out if he made decisions they didn't trust. Turning a captured prize into that kind of vessel required real expertise across multiple trades. So why didn't this fall apart? Why didn't pirate crews blow themselves up with badly mounted guns or get caught by the first naval patrol in a sluggish hull? The answer is that this wasn't luck, and it wasn't recklessness. It was a practical system built on accumulated maritime skill, captured knowledge from former merchant and naval men, a working understanding of hull design and rigging, and a pragmatic approach to violence that kept engagements short and decisive. The converted pirate vessel, at its best, was the product of genuine expertise. Let's start where everything started, with the choice of ship. Not every captured vessel was worth converting. A pirate crew that had just taken a prize had to make a rapid assessment. Was this hull fast? Was the draft shallow enough for coastal operations? Was the planking in good enough condition that she wouldn't need weeks of work before she was seaworthy? Getting that assessment wrong could cost lives. A ship too large needed more crew, more food, more guns, creating logistics problems a small pirate band couldn't easily solve. A ship too small limited the crew size and the firepower, making every engagement a gamble rather than a calculated threat. The vessels pirates actually favored tell you everything about their priorities. Sloops were among the most sought-after prizes in the Caribbean during the early 1700s. A well-built sloop was fast, drew little water, could be handled by a smaller crew, and was agile enough to work in coastal and island waters where larger ships were dangerous. Historians studying Caribbean piracy note that a good Bermuda sloop could outrun almost anything the Royal Navy deployed in those waters during that period. Pirates weren't capturing Bermuda sloops by accident. They knew what they were looking for, and when they found it, they took it. Brigantines were also popular for similar reasons. A brigantine could carry more crew and more guns than a sloop, while still being fast enough to pursue or escape a larger vessel. Bartholomew Roberts, who historians estimate captured over 400 vessels during his career, operated primarily with ships in this size range. He wasn't commanding a floating castle. He was commanding fast, well-crewed vessels that could strike targets quickly and move on before anyone organized a serious response. His career ran from 1719 until his death in 1722, and choosing the right kind of ship was a big part of why it lasted that long. The one famous exception that comes up regularly is Blackbeard, who for a period commanded Queen Anne's Revenge, a captured French slave ship armed with around 40 cannon. Historians who've looked carefully at his career note that Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground in 1718 near Beaufort Inlet in what is now North Carolina, possibly deliberately, and Blackbeard returned to smaller, faster vessels after that. Even he couldn't keep a large ship running without maintenance support. No pirate crew of that era could permanently maintain. The large vessel was a tool of intimidation that built his reputation in the short term. The smaller vessel was the actual working tool. Now here is the part most people skip past. Once a crew identified a prize worth keeping, the real work began. And it was work in the most literal sense. Physical, skilled, dirty, time-consuming, dangerous work that required men who actually knew what they were doing with a saw, an adze, a rope, a tar brush, and a block and tackle. The lightening of a prize was the first step. The original cargo was removed or distributed to the fleet. Internal walls and partitions below deck were torn out. Heavy fittings, unnecessary furniture, passenger accommodations, anything that added weight without adding value to a fast attack vessel was pulled out and either moved to another ship or thrown over the side. The amount of weight a merchant ship carried in non-essential fittings and internal structure was sometimes enough that removing it made a measurable difference in how the hull sat in the water. A hull riding even a few inches higher moved faster, and in a pursuit or an escape, Those inches could decide the outcome. The next layer was the guns. And this is where the popular image gets the important details wrong. Pirates didn't always want more guns. They wanted the right guns in the right positions. A merchant ship being converted for piracy wasn't being turned into a warship. She was being turned into a fast, intimidating attacker. That meant light to medium cannon arranged to deliver a broadside convincing enough to make a target surrender, without concentrating so much weight on the gun deck that it made the hull sluggish. The real danger of overgunning a converted vessel wasn't just about speed. It was about structural integrity. Merchant hulls weren't built to absorb the repeated shock of heavy cannon fire. Mount guns too large on a hull not designed for them, fire them in a real engagement, and you risk splitting deck planking, working the hull seams loose, or causing structural failure at the moment you can least afford it. This meant pirates had to understand something that sounds technical but was a matter of survival. Cannon weight, hull strength, and firing stress all had to be balanced against each other. That knowledge came from men who had served in navies or on armed merchant vessels, and pirate crews drew heavily on those populations. Captured sailors with naval experience, former privateers who understood weapons handling, ex-merchantmen who knew rigging and hull work. These were the men whose skills made a conversion actually possible. When a pirate captain offered a captured sailor the chance to join the crew, he was often recruiting a specific skill set he needed to keep his ship operational. The rigging changes were just as important as the guns, and they get far less attention. The rigging of a typical merchant ship was designed for safety and efficiency across long ocean passages. Conservative square rigging that was reliable in steady trade winds, but slow to respond in tight situations. Pirates operating in the Caribbean needed vessels that could come about quickly, work close to shore, catch a target on a different point of sail, or run downwind fast enough to escape a naval patrol. That often meant adding lateen sails on the mizzenmast, adjusting mast positions, adding square topsails to sloops not originally rigged for them, or changing the entire sail plan to match the new mission. These weren't minor adjustments. Changing a ship's rig was a major operation requiring skilled hands, good timber for new spars, rope for new rigging, and canvas for new or modified sails, all of which had to come from another captured prize. And this is where the system becomes interesting in a way you might not expect. Pirate crews often worked in small fleets, capturing multiple vessels across weeks or months. Those vessels fed each other. A captured sloop gave you the hull you wanted. A captured merchant gave you the canvas, rope, timber, tar, food, water, and tools needed to maintain the sloop. A captured armed vessel might give you guns, powder, and shot of better quality than anything a merchant was carrying. Every prize was a supply run as much as it was a robbery. The pirate economy of ship conversion was a continuous cycle of capture, assessment, salvage, modification, and forward movement that kept a fleet functional without any legitimate supply chain supporting it. Would you have trusted that system with your life? Leave a comment below telling me what you think was the most dangerous part of the whole operation. The conversion itself? The first engagement in an untested hull? Or the constant pressure of keeping everything running without a real home port? Now let's talk about what the maintenance cycle actually looked like in practice, because the historical record gives us real detail here. When a pirate crew careened a vessel, deliberately tilting the ship onto her side in a sheltered cove to work on the underwater hull, they were committing to a process that took several days to several weeks, depending on the condition of the bottom. The underwater hull of any wooden ship at sea for months became fouled with barnacles, weed, and, in the warm waters of the Caribbean and tropical Atlantic, riddled with damage from shipworm, a wood-boring mollusk and one of the most serious hidden threats to wooden-hulled vessels in those waters. A fouled hull was a slow hull. A hull eaten by shipworm was a dangerous hull. Pirates who careened regularly maintained faster and safer ships. Pirates who neglected it paid in lost speed and eventually in structural failure. Depositions from merchants whose ships had been taken, surviving in Admiralty and colonial archives, give us glimpses of this process in real detail. These accounts describe pirates working the hull of a vessel in a sheltered bay, multiple men over the side with scrapers, others on shore heating tar for caulking, others working the rigging while hull work continued below. It wasn't chaotic. It was organized labor, with men assigned tasks according to their skills. The carpenter was often one of the most valued men on a pirate crew, sometimes second only to the surgeon in compensation. In some surviving sets of pirate articles, carpenters and surgeons are specifically mentioned as receiving additional shares, because their skills were essential to keeping the ship and the crew alive. The surgeon connects directly to the converted ship problem in a practical way. A pirate crew operating a converted vessel in active raiding conditions took casualties. Not usually from enemy cannon fire in the dramatic way that stories suggest. Most pirate engagements ended quickly and without serious violence because the whole point of the approach was psychological. The flag, the reputation, the fast closing distance, the overwhelming apparent threat. All of it was designed to convince a target captain that resistance wasn't worth the cost. But men were wounded when targets did resist. Men fell from rigging in bad weather. Men got sick from the water supply, from the heat, from close quarters below deck where disease moved fast in tropical conditions. This is one reason pirate crews were often larger in proportion to ship size than a comparable merchant crew. More men meant more redundancy. You could lose a portion of your crew to sickness or injury and still sail and fight the ship. But larger crews meant more food, more water, more gunpowder, more of everything. And all of it had to come from prizes. This is the circular pressure every successful pirate captain had to manage continuously. The ship needed the crew to function. The crew needed food and water to survive. The food and water had to come from prizes. Prizes required the ship to be fast enough to catch them. The ship required skilled maintenance to stay fast. The maintenance required materials that also came from prizes. Break any single link in that chain, and the whole operation began to come apart, often faster than anyone could stop it. Here is a detail that rarely makes it into the popular telling of this story. The modification of a captured ship didn't happen once and stop. It happened continuously. A converted pirate vessel was never finished. She was always being adjusted, repaired, improved, or stripped for parts to feed another vessel in the fleet. Every voyage introduced new damage. Storms worked hull seams open, rigging wore through, sails split in squalls, masts cracked under wind pressure, iron fittings corroded in the salt air. The carpenter and his mates were permanently employed in a constant struggle against what the sea does to wooden ships. Every day at sea was a day the ship was being slowly taken apart by water, salt, heat, and mechanical stress. Keeping ahead of that process with limited tools and no dry dock access required genuine skill, constant improvisation, and a tolerance for conditions that would not be acceptable by any standard outside of that specific world. The choice of where to do that work was itself a tactical problem. You couldn't careen a vessel in a major colonial port without being seen and reported. The geography of the Caribbean, the Bahamas, the Carolinas, and other piracy hotspots of the period wasn't random. Those locations offered combinations of factors that made pirate operations practically possible. Hidden anchorages, fresh water sources, local populations willing to trade without too many questions, and coastlines that were difficult for large naval vessels to navigate at speed. Nassau in the Bahamas, before the British cleaned it up in 1718, was the most developed example. The harbor was too shallow for Royal Navy warships. The surrounding islands offered countless hiding places, and there was a local economy built around buying stolen goods and providing services that no one was examining too closely. The men who ran those shoreside operations are part of this story that doesn't get nearly enough attention. A pirate crew wanting to convert a prize needed someone willing to sell them tar and timber without filing a report. They needed a local blacksmith who could work iron fittings without reporting his customers. They needed a merchant willing to buy cargo from the original prize without asking obvious questions. The whole system depended not just on what happened on the water, but on a network of shoreside participants taking their own calculated risks in exchange for a share of the pirate economy. Some were doing it voluntarily and profitably. Some were doing it because refusing would have been dangerous. Some were doing it because the colonial economy of those islands was so mixed up with contraband trade that the line between legitimate commerce and pirate support was genuinely hard to draw. The colonial governors officially responsible for stopping all of this were often caught in the same web. A governor in the Bahamas or Jamaica or the Carolinas was managing a territory with limited legitimate economic development, a small underfunded administration, minimal military force, and a local merchant class dependent on the low-cost goods the pirate trade was supplying. Officially, they were supposed to hunt pirates down, try them, and hang them. Some did exactly that with genuine dedication. But others looked the other way, accepted informal payments for harbor access, and allowed converted pirate vessels to anchor in colonial waters under the pretense of holding legitimate privateering commissions. Everyone inside the system had a reason to keep it working. Bartholomew Roberts understood this calculation better than almost anyone in the surviving record. The articles from his crew are among the most detailed examples of written crew agreements from the pirate era. They covered the division of shares, compensation for injuries, punishment for desertion, and limits on what any individual, including the captain, could do without the crew's consent. When you read them as a practical operational document, you see a captain managing a mobile workforce on converted vessels with no fixed base, no legal protection, and no margin for serious internal breakdown. They worked precisely because they addressed the actual problems crews faced in that situation. Now, let's bring in the human cost, because the men who kept these converted ships running were not living comfortable lives. Picture yourself on one of those vessels in the Caribbean in July. The temperature below deck is brutal. The air is thick, humid, and carries the smell of bilge water, tar, salt, and sweat. Everything is permanently damp. The food is getting worse as the weeks extend. The hardtack has insects in it. The salt pork is questionable. The fresh water is running low, and what remains has been sitting in barrels long enough to turn foul. You've been at sea for 3 weeks without a clean water source, and the only prospect of improvement is taking another prize carrying a full water supply in good condition. This wasn't a life that attracted men because it was comfortable. It attracted men because their alternatives on shore, or on a legitimate merchant vessel, were often nearly as hard and paid far worse. A merchant sailor in the 1710s could expect strict discipline, minimal wages, and no share in the profits of his labor. A Royal Navy sailor could expect press gang conscription and wages sometimes years in arrears because the naval pay system was genuinely dysfunctional. A pirate crew, by contrast, was offered shares of everything taken, a vote on major decisions, including who captained the ship, and written articles that spelled out compensation for injuries and limits on individual authority. The pirate ship's appeal wasn't freedom in any idealized sense. It was a slightly more equitable version of a brutal maritime economy, with a death sentence attached. In 1718, when the Royal Navy deployed warships specifically to the Caribbean to hunt pirate vessels, the calculation changed for every captain operating in those waters. A vessel that had previously been fast enough to escape anything the local colonial authorities had available was no longer necessarily fast enough once properly armed Royal Navy frigates arrived on station. Captains who had been comfortable with converted sloops and brigantines had to reconsider their whole approach. Some tried to capture larger vessels to match the new threat. Some moved operations to different waters entirely. Some took advantage of the royal pardon being offered and tried to exit the business. The ones who kept operating in the Caribbean found that the conversion advantages they had built up were being matched by a dedicated naval response for the first time. The system was still working, but the margin was narrowing fast. If you've watched this far and you want more of this kind of history, subscribe to Dead Man's Shore. It helps the channel more than you might think, and we put out new episodes regularly on the real maritime world behind the legend. Let's return to that prize sitting low in the water at the beginning of this story, because what happened next is the whole point. The assessment was made. The hull was good, Bermuda built, recently careened by her original owners, drawing enough water to be stable in open sea, but shallow enough to work the coastal islands. The original cargo was distributed across the fleet over the course of the afternoon. The interior partitions below deck came out over the next 2 days, crews working in the cramped heat of the hold with axes and pry bars. Some of the original merchant guns were swapped for lighter pieces taken from a previous prize stripped for exactly this purpose. The rigging was adjusted, a new topsail added to the mainmast to improve performance in light, variable winds. 2 additional men from the captured crew were offered shares and accepted, both riggers with skills the fleet genuinely needed. Inside a week, she was a different vessel, faster, lighter, and more dangerous than anything her original builders had intended. That transformation is the real story. Not the mythology of piracy, not the romantic version sold across 4 centuries of popular culture, but the practical reality of skilled, dangerous, continuous work done by men who had no other way to stay ahead of the forces trying to hang them. The converted pirate vessel was not a symbol of freedom. She was a tool built out of necessity. She was fast because she had to be. She was lightly armed because overgunning her would have killed her speed and possibly her crew. She was constantly maintained because the sea does not forgive neglect. And she was always temporary, always borrowed from someone else's work, always one bad storm or one careless navigation decision away from becoming a wreck on a reef somewhere in the islands. That is the real story of the pirate ship. Not built for glory, built to survive.